Under a sky of falling snow and silent pine trees, a father, his fragile little boy, and a loyal German shepherd stand on the edge of a winter secret that will change their lives forever. In the coldest town of Montana, something dangerous is happening inside a warm wooden house, and only one creature senses the truth long before anyone else. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from and drop your location in the comments. And if you believe every story deserves to be told and every life deserves protection, press subscribe to support this channel and continue this journey with us. Winter had turned Blue Ridge, a small mountain town in western Montana, into a quiet cathedral of glassy ice and kneeling snowdrifts, where every rooftop carried a soft burden of white and every pine tree bent like an old pilgrim under the weight of the season. The air was brittle, crackling with cold, each exhale turning to pale clouds that vanished like ghosts against the unending landscape. On the crest of a slope stood a sturdy log house, cedar-brown walls, stone chimney, windows rounded at the corner like the nostalgic touches of another era. Inside this house lived Elias Rowan, age 38, a police officer in the K-9 division of Blue Ridge Sheriff Department. Elias was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a body hardened by years of winter patrols and the muscle-deep instincts of law enforcement, yet his face had softened into a quiet sadness. He had dark hair now flecked with early streaks of gray that had appeared after the accident 2 winters ago, and a pair of deep-set hazel eyes that were always searching, once scanning streets for criminals, now searching his own heart for pieces of peace. The loss of his wife, Clara Rowan, in a treacherous ice road crash, had carved silent chambers inside him, rooms of grief that never quite melted. On most evenings, when the world retreated into frost and moonlight, Elias would sit at the edge of his bed with an old wedding photograph, a younger him with Clara beneath a blue summer sky, until the ache became unbearable and he folded it away again. In that same house dwelled his 6-year-old son, Mason Rowan. Mason was small for his age, slender like a sapling yet unbowed, though his silence often made him seem like a lonely shadow. He had pale skin, hair the color of dry wheat, and gray eyes muted by a quiet that's unusual for a child. Mason rarely spoke, though he listened intensely, with a kind of fragile alertness, always gripping a worn plush bear missing one eye, named Captain. He had clung to that bear since the day of his mother's funeral, as though it held the last echoes of her warmth. Where Elias carried grief like stone beneath his ribs, Mason carried it like thin mist over his heart. Rocco was the 3rd resident of the Rowan household, though Elias would say he was not just a dog, he was a partner. Rocco was a 7-year-old German shepherd, tall, muscular, with sable-black fur that lightened into deep amber around his legs and chest. His ears stood like polished sentinels, and his golden-toned eyes seemed older than his years, touched by the instincts of a protector that had been honed through countless missions with Elias. Rocco had been trained as a K-9 tracking and alert dog, originally from a well-known Texas training facility, where he had been selected as the top of his litter for both intelligence and emotional resilience. With strangers he was cautious, with adversaries he was swift, and with the Rowan family he was steady as stone. Every night he would lie, outside Mason's door, chin resting on his paws, alert to every creak of wood and flutter of breath. On this particular evening, as snow continued to fall in the thick spirals that turned the air white, Elias stood in the entryway returning from a 12-hour shift. He wore a heavy sheriff-issue winter coat, lined with wool, boots caked in ice crystals, and a fatigue in his bones that made each step deliberate. He had answered calls of skidding trucks, a missing hiker found half frozen under a ridge, and a domestic dispute turned quiet argument after Rocco's intimidating stance at the door. But the hardest part of his day had not been those calls. It had been leaving his son in the care of someone else. For several weeks now, Layla Hart had been coming regularly to the house. Layla was a 32-year-old community healthcare worker employed by the county's winter mental health outreach program. She stood about average height, slender, with long ash-brown hair often pulled back loosely, revealing soft features and calm eyes of blue-green that radiated reassurance. Her voice was gentle, nearly melodic, and she had a way of speaking that seemed to lower the volume of the world around her. Layla carried herself with the careful sensitivity of someone who knew how to enter a grieving family's life without leaving loud footprints. Her Her personality gave the impression of quiet compassion, patience, and an intuitive warmth that put people at ease. When she walked through the home, she didn't move like a visitor. She moved like someone attending to a fragile ecosystem. Layla had grown up in Minnesota in a house with freezing winters and long nights. Her father, a paramedic, had died on shift during a rescue mission when she was 17. That loss had pushed her toward medicine, trauma response, and later, mental health care. To Elias, her background felt like the bridge of empathy he needed, someone who knew loss and carried it with grace. Over the weeks, she had folded herself into the Rowan routine almost effortlessly. She would arrive during late afternoons when Elias needed an hour of rest before his night shift. She would help tidy the kitchen, heat soup on the stove, coax Mason into answering simple questions, sometimes even laugh at small things to lift the boy's spirits. She often brought over children's books, or a puzzle set, or a winter-safe humidifier. Her presence slowly filled the quiet corners of the dwelling like a soft light returning to a dark room. Yet, there were moments, small, unnoticed by Elias, when something in the atmosphere shifted. When Layla approached Mason, Rocco would move slightly forward, placing himself between them. When Layla handed Mason a cup of warm cocoa, Rocco would sniff the rim as though cataloging every scent in the chemical universe. Once, when Layla leaned close to Mason to wipe his cheek with a soft cloth, Rocco's ears pricked, tail stiff, nostrils flaring with the sharpness of instinct. Elias had laughed each time, brushing it off. "He's just protective," he'd say. "He'll get used to you." And Layla would smile politely, but something unreadable would flicker in the quiet space behind her eyes. Bystanders in Blue Ridge seldom entered such private matters, but there was one neighbor who took quiet notice: Mildred Carver, the 70-year-old widow who lived alone in the adjacent cabin. Mildred was a small, stooped woman with silver-white hair pinned into a tidy bun, and a face lined not just by age but by years of resolving winter crises for half-feral cats and orphaned birds. She had lived in Blue Ridge longer than anyone, and carried a spirit threaded with old-world intuition. She believed that dogs, unlike humans, rarely lied about their feelings. Over the past weeks, Mildred had heard the subtle nocturnal sounds: Rocco's muffled pacing, his soft whimpers at Mason's door, and sometimes, buried beneath the wind's howl, his long, mournful winter howl that echoed through the snow like an omen. This evening, inside the warm glow of the Rowan household, Elias shrugged off his coat and laid it on the rack. Layla was in the kitchen ladling soup into bowls. Mason sat at the small dinner table, shoulders slightly curled inward, eyes shadowed with drowsy fatigue beyond normal childhood sleepiness. Rocco lay under the table, though not relaxed, his posture taut, vigilant. And though Elias didn't yet see it, there were already subtle patterns in motion. Mason drinking only from cups given by Layla documenting his symptom diary with clinical neatness, Elias allowing more emotional trust than medical scrutiny, and Rocco, as always, the silent sentinel. Outside, the storm continued its quiet rain, laying fresh white over old white, turning the town into a hushed world of snow-draped rooftops and dim lantern windows. Inside, the soup steamed, the clock ticked, and the first faint tension of a gathering storm, this one not of weather but of destiny, began to tighten its silent threads. The heart of winter deepened its grip on Blue Ridge, turning the world into something still and half-forgotten. Snow no longer fell in playful flakes, but in long, silent sheets, like curtains slowly closing across the mountains. The air was so cold, it seemed to sharpen hearing. Every sound became clearer: a shovel scraping pavement 2 houses away, an owl's wing slicing through the dark, and later, in the night, the unmistakable voice of Rocco. Elias had begun working more night shifts. The sheriff's department was chronically understaffed during winter, when accidents surged and tempers frayed from cabin fever. And so, these days, Elias was gone long after Mason had already been put to bed. Layla stayed late more often, quietly assuming responsibility. In daylight hours, she remained gentle, nurturing, and attentive. In the evenings, her soft-spoken presence in the Rowan home felt like a candle flickering in an old church. It seemed harmless, almost holy. At first, Mason's changes were so subtle they could be explained away. He began going to bed early, yawning heavily after dinner. Layla would stroke his hair, and her voice, a warm lullaby, would coax him into early slumber. "It's natural," she said soothingly one evening when Elias mentioned how tired Mason seemed. "He's processing emotional stress. His nervous system is still recovering from early trauma." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like knowledge born from care. Elias lifted his son and carried him upstairs, feeling the limpness of those small limbs, more like a sleeping bird than a child, and assumed it was exhaustion. But Rocco did not assume. The shepherd had begun monitoring every action. He would sniff cups, napkins, spoons, blankets. When Layla opened the cabinet in the kitchen, Rocco would step closer. When she poured liquid medicine into a spoon, he would watch with the unblinking intensity of a hunter. Layla would smile toward Elias. "He's just curious. He's such a smart boy." But Rocco was not curious. He was calculating. One night, Layla poured the usual teaspoon of syrup and passed it to Mason with a gentle whisper. Mason, though obedient, hesitated. His lower lip trembled as if from cold, but the room was warm. His small fingers clutched Captain, the one-eyed bear, so tightly his knuckles whitened. Rocco leaned in and sniffed. A low rumble began in his throat. Layla frowned and drew the spoon back slightly. "Rocco, no, bad boy." She placed her hand on his snout, but Rocco jerked away, eyes locked on the spoon. Mason finally took the medicine and swallowed. His eyelids fell within seconds. Layla carried him upstairs, and Rocco followed. But when she stepped onto the staircase, Rocco rushed forward, body lowering, lips lifting slightly off his teeth. Layla stumbled back and let out a startled gasp. "Elias!" she called out sharply. Elias appeared in the doorway, eyebrows raised. "He almost pushed me down the stairs." Elias's gaze hardened. "Rocco, back." Rocco obeyed the voice of command, but not the sentiment. He retreated, yet his stare never left Layla. Elias picked Rocco up by the collar and led him outside to the back porch. Snow had stopped falling, but lay in untouched waves across the yard. Elias closed the door behind him, and through the glass, Rocco's eyes glowed with reflected moonlight. For the first time in years, Elias raised his voice in frustration. "You're acting out! She's helping us!" Rocco's ears flattened. His breathing became shallow. But, most telling of all, was his silence. Not fear, not guilt, only restrained urgency. As the night deepened, sometime past 2 a.m., Rocco began to howl. It wasn't random barking at passing deer or the territorial cry of a guard dog. It was a sustained, mournful howl, ancient and primal, the call of a wolf warning its pack. Mildred Carver, in her nearby cabin, woke from sleep. She sat up in bed, listening. She had lived with animals all her life. She knew the language of hushed nights, and that sound, the long reverberating echo rising through the cold, was the sound of foreboding. "That dog is telling the world something's wrong," she whispered into the dark. The next days passed like a strange winter mirage, one that looked normal from a distance but warped upon closer inspection. Layla began altering Mason's treatment, though she called it adjustment in gentle therapeutic dosing. The syrup was given twice a day now. Mason's energy waned. He no longer asked to play. He rarely looked outside the window, even when elk passed through the snowfield, a sight that once thrilled him. His limbs lost spring. He sat more, slumped more. Layla always had explanations ready. Neurological fatigue, winter depression, post-traumatic regression. Elias nodded. As a police officer, he was comfortable identifying lies in criminals, but heartbreakingly naive in matters of medicine. And exhaustion made his judgment soft. But Rocco was not tired, and though he could not speak, his every gesture shouted. He sniffed Mason's pillow each morning, as though trying to track a vanishing scent of vitality. He paced outside Mason's room until the floor rug was scuffed. He would not drink water offered by Layla, and often refused food she set down when Elias was not home. On one especially frigid evening, the wind whipped against the windows like claws scratching glass. Layla told Elias she would put Mason to bed. Rocco followed her. Halfway up the stairs, she turned, irritation showing through the sugar of her voice. "No, stay." But the command did not hold. Rocco pushed forward, ears pinned, stance rigid. Layla closed Mason's bedroom door behind her, but Rocco planted himself outside. He lay still as stone, head up, eyes never blinking. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 40. Then the door opened. Layla stepped out quietly. Rocco immediately rose. A smell drifted from the room, unnatural, medicinal, cold. Rocco uttered a quiet, chuffing growl, not threatening, but deeply alert. The kind of sound wild canines use to warn their kin of poison in water or rot in food. Layla stared at him with a stern, tight-lipped glare. One day, Elias will have to choose between me and you. It was whisper soft, but Rocco heard. And in those words, anything sweet in Layla's tone dissolved. Hours later, long after Elias had left for work, Mildred saw something odd from her window. Layla exiting the Rowan house, coat buttoned, face unseen, and walking briskly away through snow toward the main road. In her gloved hand was a small dark bag. Rocco remained on the porch, watching her until she disappeared into the whiteness. Only then did he resume his pacing. The next morning, Mason's skin looked paler. Even Elias noticed. Over breakfast, Mason barely lifted his spoon. "Buddy?" Elias knelt beside him, voice soft. "You feeling okay?" Mason tried to answer, but only a mumble came. Then he touched his chest, very lightly, as if pressing their hurt. Layla arrived shortly after, bright smile, encouraging tone. "It's normal, Elias. His body's adapting." Rocco moved between them. That was the moment when Elias frowned, not in anger, but confusion. A crack in his trust. He had always believed his dog. He had always trusted Rocco's instincts. And yet, these last few weeks, he had ignored them. Something had begun to shift in him. But change often begins as a whisper. Night came again. Snow thickened. Layla left the house at 8. Elias worked until dawn. Mason slept, shallow and cold. But Rocco did not sleep, not at all. His ears flicked toward every faint sound from Mason's room. He paced. He waited. And when the hour grew deep and silent, he lifted his muzzle and unleashed a howl that trembled across the snowy valley. It was not a cry. It was a warning, a plea, a call for help. Winter's siege over Blue Ridge reached its peak, temperatures dropping so low that even the breath of living beings became brittle. Icicles hung from rooftops like crystal fangs, and street lamps glowed inside halos of frost. Inside the Rowan household, warmth from the fireplace flickered, but it did not reach Mason's body. Something colder, deeper, more insidious was creeping inside him. Layla's presence had grown more constant. Elias, overworked and financially strained, accepted her help with gratitude at first, then dependence, and finally automatic trust. She had become a fixture in their lives, like the kitchen lamp or the coat rack by the door. Except the lamp never selected cups or syringes. Layla did. She began to speak in increasingly clinical tones. "We need to slightly enhance his treatment to support neurological stability," she explained one late afternoon as she prepared Mason's evening medicine. "He's under deep emotional stress. These adjustments are minor." She showed Elias a store-bought bottle of mild children's sleep syrup, perfectly legal. But the real additions came from the small dark bag she carried in her purse. Her movements were practiced, smooth, like someone assembling delicate clockwork. Mason sat in his chair, legs dangling, eyelids heavy. He seemed to drift through the house like a ghost of himself, fragile and quiet. The vigor that belonged to a 6-year-old boy had ebbed into stillness. He rarely spoke, but sometimes his eyes said everything: fear, discomfort, confusion. When Layla approached with the spoon, his breath would hitch, but he obeyed. Because children obey adults, especially ones who smile gently. Rocco smelled the dropper before Mason even saw it. Every evening he edged closer. Layla would push him back gently, sometimes with irritation, sometimes feigned kindness. "He's fine, Rocco. I know what I'm doing." But Rocco's instincts were sharpening. He would smell the rim of Mason's cup, even when empty. He would sniff the blanket after Mason fell asleep. He would rest his head against the boy's small chest, as if checking his breathing, and every night something seemed wrong. Mason's skin would turn cooler, his heartbeat changed, slower, shallower, and his little hand, clutching Captain the stuffed bear, would twitch weakly in sleep. One night, snowstorm winds shook the house like a restless hand. Layla stood beside Mason's bed, administering the usual medicine. But this time, she added a second liquid, clear, odorless, drawn from a small bottle with a torn label. Rocco surged forward from the doorway. A growl rolled from his chest, a raw, primal sound. Layla turned quickly, eyes flashing. "Get out!" she snapped. But Rocco matched her stare and did not move. His hackles rose, ears flattened, pupils dark and wide. Mason lay motionless, chest barely rising. Elias, hearing commotion from downstairs, called up, "Everything okay?" Layla's voice instantly switched tone, smooth, mild, reassuring. "Just your pup being dramatic. I've got it." But Rocco kept growling softly, a kind of low, vibrating hum of warning. He took another step forward. Layla's hand hovered over Mason's chest, for just a second longer than natural. Then she withdrew the dropper, tucked it quickly into her bag, and lifted Mason's tiny wrist as if checking pulse. But her eyes flicked toward Rocco with a silent promise of retaliation. After Elias went to bed, exhaustion crushing him, Layla slipped quietly downstairs, passing the living room toward the kitchen. Rocco followed. He moved with silent steps, like a shadow with muscle and fur. Layla lifted a glass Mason had used earlier, tilted it under the sink, washed it thoroughly. Too thoroughly. She scrubbed the lip twice, then 3 times. Then she rinsed the spoon. Rocco stared, unmoving. Layla glanced at him sideways, voice a low hiss. "You're in the way." She dried the spoon, put it back, not where Elias used to keep it, but into a different drawer, a detail Elias might not notice. But Rocco did. Later, near midnight, Rocco padded to Mason's bedside. He nudged the boy's hand. Mason did not stir. Rocco let out a quiet whine, the sound of sorrow. A few hours later, just before dawn, Mildred Carver sat at her window, teacup steaming in her wrinkled hands. She watched lights flicker in the Rowan house and heard again the faint drop of Rocco's voice, a howl that didn't want to exist, an instinct forced into sound. Mildred murmured, "That dog is begging someone to listen." The next days formed a grim progression. Mason's energy diminished further. He would wake with shivers, teeth chattering softly even when wrapped in blankets. His feet felt cold to the touch, like snow-packed boots. Elias noticed enough to raise concern, barely. "He's been shivering. Is that normal?" Layla nodded quickly. "Yes. The nervous system reacts to trauma by altering thermal perception. It's psychosomatic." Again, the words sounded medical enough. And Elias was tired. The man who had once interrogated criminals with razor intuition could barely interrogate his own fading vigilance. He had a job, a son, a debt, a wound, a winter. Layla had answers. Rocco had alarms. Elias sided with the answers. One evening, after giving Mason the medicine, Layla headed up the stairs, but Rocco blocked her path physically. He stood sideways, shoulder broad, body sturdy, forming a barrier, eyes locked, breath held. Layla stared at him for a long moment, face empty of expression. Then she tried to step around. Rocco moved with her. One step, another block. This time Layla snapped, not loud, but venomous. "Move, dog!" Rocco lowered his head, bared his teeth, not with aggression, but with a warning drawn from wolves buried in his lineage. Layla turned to Elias with quick theatrical hurt. "He's aggressive with me now. You need to discipline him before he bites someone." Elias's jaw tightened. "Rocco, back." But this time, Rocco did not obey immediately. He looked from Elias to Mason's door to Layla and back to Elias. And in that second, the dog was pleading. Elias felt something stir, uncertainty, or conscience, but he dismissed it. "Back," he repeated, and finally Rocco retreated, slowly, reluctantly. That night, Mason's condition worsened. Layla cracked open the bedroom window for circulation. Icy air curled inside and sank into Mason's weakened body. The boy shook with spasms of shivering. Layla sat beside him, murmuring soft assurances, while the cold deepened around him. But Rocco, outside the locked door, scratched and pawed at the wood until his claws left marks. Snow pressed against the windows, wind clawed at the walls, and inside the house, a child's life was being pulled downward into a lethargy like a sinking stone. Elias lay on his bed unable to sleep, mind uneasy, but not yet knowing why. A whisper of intuition brushed him, a father's instinct, a cop's instinct, but neither shouted loud enough to shake him awake. Rocco did not sleep. The shepherd sat outside Mason's door, fur bristling, eyes burning with alert devotion. He could smell the altered chemistry in the boy's blood. He could smell the foreign compounds. He could smell the diminishing vital signals. He could smell what Layla pretended was healing, but was harm. When the house fell silent and cold, Rocco pressed his nose to the gap beneath the bedroom door and released another howl, not loud, not desperate, but steady. A tone like a church bell rung for a fading life. A call for help in a house deaf to it. The winter night over Blue Ridge was starless, and the snowfall had ceased, leaving behind a heavy stillness that felt almost staged. Elias drove home along the icy mountain road, headlights sweeping over the reflective white surface like searching eyes. He had been called into a graveyard shift for a domestic dispute, only to be unexpectedly relieved halfway through by another officer. Their replacement arrived early, a convenience Elias did not question at first. He simply accepted it with weary gratitude and turned toward home, eager for a moment of comfort and a glimpse of his son's resting face. His mind rehearsed the usual scene: Mason asleep, Rocco curled nearby, Layla reading by the warmth of the fire. But tonight, something unsettled him. A faint wrongness hummed inside him, like distant thunder he couldn't yet hear. When he stepped onto the porch, boots crunching snow, he noticed there was no bark, no thumping of paws against the floor, no excited rush of fur. Rocco always greeted him. That absence struck first. He unlocked the door quietly, but the silence inside felt like a vacuum. No TV murmuring, no soft cooing of Layla's voice, no footsteps, just an eerie stillness. His police instincts, once dulled, now sharpened. He scanned the living room with the eye of a trained officer, mugs on the table, lights dimmed, no signs of struggle, but no signs of living presence either. Then he heard it, a muffled scrape from outside. He opened the back door and found Rocco in the small storage shed, chained. The chain was taut, as if the dog had pulled until his muscles trembled. His fur was dusted with frost, breath steaming heavily. His eyes were red, not from aggression, but from exhaustion and distress. Elias's pulse spiked. "What are you doing out here?" But Rocco didn't answer with sound. He answered with motion. The dog lunged toward the door, chain rattling violently. Elias unhooked the metal clasp, and Rocco shot past him like a released arrow, straight to the staircase. Elias ran after him. The dog stopped at Mason's bedroom door, chest heaving, body rigid. Elias turned the handle slowly. The room felt wrong. The rest of the house held warmth, but here the air was cold and sharp like a refrigerated space. Mason lay on his bed, blankets half pushed aside, skin pale with bluish tint. Elias rushed to him, placing his palm on his son's cheek, and recoiled slightly. The boy was cold. Not just cool skin, cold. Elias whispered, fear creeping in. "Mason? Hey, buddy." The boy's lips parted slightly, breath coming in shallow, fragile wisps. In the hallway, Layla's voice appeared suddenly, too quickly, as if she'd been waiting. "You're home early." Elias turned sharply. "Why is his room so cold?" Layla stepped forward, holding her notebook. "He has a winter virus that causes mild hypothermia. I opened the window slightly to help oxygen flow and reduce viral density." Her explanation came swiftly, too swiftly. She held up her handwritten chart. Temperature readings meticulously recorded, heart rate, sleep cycle notes, all appearing neat and professional. Elias stared at the paper, but something in him shifted. He had seen professional paperwork before, in counterfeit insurance claims, forged rental agreements, doctored alibis. and something Rocco had done now caught his eye. The dog moved between Layla and Mason, posture protective, head lowered, ears back, tail stiff. Layla frowned. "He's being aggressive again?" But Elias, kneeling beside Mason, noticed something. The boy's fingers were stiff, his nails dusky, his breathing thin. He had worked enough overdose cases, enough toxic exposures. He recognized this pattern, not of flu, but of bodily shutdown. In a strange cinematic moment, Elias's breath became visible in the cold air of the room, and it struck him. The heater downstairs is running full blast. But this room is freezing. Layla's tone became defensive. "You don't understand pediatric distress response." He cut her off, not with words, but by lifting Mason carefully into his arms. The boy was unnaturally limp, fragile in a way that ignited the primal fear of a parent. Elias turned toward the door. "We're going to the hospital." Layla's composure wavered for the first time. "That's not necessary. I'm monitoring." "Now," Elias commanded, not as a father, but as an officer. Mason made a faint noise, almost a whimper, head lolling onto Elias's chest. The urgency tightened its grip. Elias grabbed Mason's shoes to put them on. The left shoe felt heavier than the right. He shook it, like a cop testing a clue, and something small tumbled out and clinked onto the hardwood floor. A glass vial. Rocco growled low, almost vibrating. Layla froze. Elias lifted the vial, reading the faint label. His stomach turned. This was not children's cold medicine. This was a muscle relaxant, a respiratory suppressant used in adult clinical settings and tightly controlled. "What is this?" Layla's face contorted then. No longer gentle caretaker, no longer soft healer, but something colder. She opened her mouth, perhaps to lie, or to explain. But Elias turned away. He thundered down the stairs carrying Mason, with Rocco bounding alongside, hot breath puffing clouds through the frigid air. The truck engine roared as they pulled into the road. Snow swirled violently around them as tires chewed through ice. Every minute felt like a grain of sand slipping away. Elias kept one hand on the wheel and one arm around Mason, as though physically holding him to life. Rocco sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes fixed forward, silent but alert like a soldier. The hospital lights finally came into view, a beacon of fluorescent salvation in the freezing dark. Dr. Samuel Reed, a seasoned pediatric physician with kind, tired eyes, met them at the emergency bay. He recognized Elias and sprang into action with no questions asked. Within moments, Mason was taken to treatment, IV lines, warm compresses, oxygen assistance. Meanwhile, Elias handed Dr. Reed the vial. His voice cracked. "Tell me what's been happening to my son." The doctor studied the vial, eyebrows knitting. Then his expression hardened into anger, a rare and unmistakable kind. "Where did he get this?" "From someone I trusted," Elias whispered. And nearby, Rocco pressed his head against Elias's leg, breathing steady, presence solid as stone. The emergency ward of Blue Ridge General hummed with a rhythm Elias remembered. Beeps of heart monitors, murmurs of nurses exchanging clipped instructions, the crisp snap of gloves, the hiss of oxygen flow. But this time, he wasn't the officer standing by to take statements or guard a suspect. He was a father pressed against the glass of the pediatric treatment room, watching his child fight for warmth and breath. Mason looked impossibly small on the hospital bed, his legs like twigs beneath thin blankets, chest rising shallowly. Dr. Samuel Reed, now in green scrubs, commanded the room with a quiet authority. Reed was a man in his late 40s with the face of someone who had seen too many winters and too many emergencies, but refused to let cynicism win. He had thinning sandy hair and gentle brown eyes framed by smile lines that had once belonged to a more optimistic age. Now, his expression tightened with grim clarity as he examined the monitors. "Warm saline, increased by 20%, he directed. A nurse complied instantly. Next came the test, taking a blood sample for toxicology. The syringe slid in smoothly, and Mason barely stirred. Elias winced, not because of the needle, but because his boy didn't even react to it. That was wrong. That was terrifying. On the floor beside him, Rocco lay with front paws crossed, head between them, eyes fixed on Mason, like a guard carved from fur and bone. Dr. Reed finally stepped back from the bustle and approached Elias. "Come with me," he said. They walked down a hallway lit by cool white fluorescence. Elias noticed his own reflection in the glass. Jaw tight, face drawn, eyes hollow. Rocco padded silently beside him. Reed stopped at a counter, opened the vial Elias had brought, raised it to the light. He read the faded pharmacological label. His voice became lead. "This is a neuromuscular relaxant, not meant for children, not a medicine, a suppressor. It slows respiration, slows circulation. If given steadily over time..." Elias finished the sentence, voice like gravel. "It makes the body shut down." Reed looked at him, sadness and anger intertwined. "Yes." Elias breathed out slowly. He needed a moment to absorb it. The world felt like a fragile pane of ice under his feet. "He would have died if I came home an hour later." The doctor nodded. "You brought him just in time." Through the glass, they watched Mason's bed being surrounded by heated blankets and a thermal lamp. Reed continued, "We need to know exactly how much has been in his blood. The test will take an hour, but I'll be honest, I've seen enough cases to sense the pattern. Your son is suffering from induced hypothermia and cumulative respiratory suppression. Whoever was doing this knew how to disguise it. Warm room, cold child, fake logs of medical monitoring." Reed paused. "Almost convincing." Elias clenched his fists. He had trusted Layla, trusted the soothing tone, trusted the credentials. "I allowed her into our home," he murmured. "I handed my son to her." Rocco rose and pressed his head against Elias's hip, steadying him. At that moment, a pair of uniformed officers entered the corridor, Deputy Sloan and Deputy Harrell. Sloan was in his 30s, tall, blonde, a pragmatic type with an unshakable sense of procedure. Harrell was older, stocky, skeptical, a veteran of too many interrogations. They had been summoned by the hospital. Sloan spoke first. "Elias, we've detained Layla Hart. She was taken into a holding room for questioning." Elias's reaction was immediate, controlled but urgent. "Where is she?" "Down the hall in the interview suite." "I'm going," Elias said. Harrell raised a calming hand. "Elias, you're not part of this investigation. You're the complainant. You can't interrogate her." That made sense legally, but his gut burned with the need, not for violence, but for truth. Rocco growled softly, not at the deputies, but at the shadow of Layla's name. Sloan continued, "We'll take your statement after the tox screen results come in, but for now, you need to stay here." Elias nodded reluctantly. His attention drifted back to the glass window of Mason's ward. Nurses worked with gentle precision. Warmth returned to his son, one heartbeat at a time. Inside the interview room, Layla Hart sat at a narrow table with her hands clasped in front of her. Her hair was slightly disheveled from being escorted, her eyes restless. She still attempted to maintain a facade of innocence, soft voice, slight tremble. "There's been a misunderstanding." Harrell silenced her gently. "Don't speak yet. Your rights first." When formalities ended, Harrell opened a folder. "Explain the vial found in Mason's shoe." Layla blinked too slowly. "That wasn't mine. I don't know how it got there." Harrell's calm demeanor didn't crack. "Do you expect us to believe the 6-year-old was hiding pharmaceutical agents in his footwear?" She tried another angle. "I intended no harm. I was helping him sleep, helping him regulate his anxiety." Sloan leaned forward. "By lowering core body temperature and collapsing respiratory function." Her jaw clenched. "I'm not a monster." She said it like a confession disguised as protest. Outside the room, Elias watched through the security monitor feed. Layla looked smaller now, not nurturing, not tragic, just hollow. For a moment, his memories flickered. Layla's gentle laugh in the kitchen, her calm explanations, the way Mason weakened little by little, and behind all of it, Rocco's warning eyes. After almost an hour, a lab technician approached Dr. Reed with a printout. Reed scanned it, nodded gravely. He approached Elias. "Blood test confirms presence of the muscle relaxant and traces of secondary depressants. enough to reduce reflexive breathing. Rage lit in Elias's chest, but he swallowed it. He needed to stay rooted. For Mason. Reed placed a hand on his shoulder. Your son is responding to treatment. We believe he will recover. Elias closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Rocco nuzzled his palm. Back in the interview room, Layla shifted in her seat. Sloan laid the test results in front of her. This is done, he said softly. It's better to stop lying. Layla stared at the paper, then her voice cracked. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Harold's brows lowered. What was supposed to happen? Layla's mask began to crumble. Words slipped out, quiet but unsettling. I thought, if he stayed weak, Elias would need me. Depend on me. I could fix his fevers, soothe his shivering, be the cure, not the cause. She looked up, eyes watery, voice trembling with a twisted longing. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to matter. Silence followed, heavy as snow on a roof. Elias turned away from the monitor. He couldn't look at her another moment. He walked back toward Mason's room. Nurse Carter, a kind middle-aged woman with warm African-American features and a reassuring smile, stood by the door. He's warming up nicely, she said. Elias stepped inside. He placed a gentle hand on Mason's forehead. Warmth, real warmth. Mason stirred, eyes fluttering. A faint whisper slipped from his lips. Daddy? Elias bent over him. I'm here, buddy. I'm right here. For the first time in weeks, Mason's voice sounded like a child again. Slowly, he moved his small hand to rest against Elias's cheek. Then he turned his eyes, just slightly, toward Rocco, and the dog wagged his tail, once, like a pledge fulfilled. In that moment, Elias whispered into his son's soft hair, He saved you, and I'll never ignore him again. The fluorescent lights, the faint beeping, the warmth returning, became a quiet symphony of survival. But outside, in the interview room, Layla's words still echoed through minds and corridors. I wanted to matter, and yet, the one who mattered most tonight was the dog who could not speak, yet said everything. The final stretch of winter in Blue Ridge was like a slow exhale. The nights were still cold, but the air had loosened its icy grip. Snowbanks shrank day by day, dripping into rivulets that trickled along the sloping streets and vanished into thawing earth. The transition from white to brown to green felt like the town itself was waking from a long, unnatural sleep. Elias sat on the front steps of the log house, coffee in hand, watching Mason in the yard. The boy wore a thick sweater and a knitted cap that Mildred had made him, a deep forest green with a tiny embroidered paw print on the side. Mason wasn't running just yet. His legs were still regaining strength, but he was walking with a steadiness that warmed Elias more than the coffee ever could. Each step was a miracle disguised as ordinary movement. Beside the boy, Rocco walked at perfect pace, neither too fast nor too slow, nudging him gently when the ground dipped or tilted. The shepherd had become more than a guardian. He had become a constant reassurance, like a heartbeat beside Mason. Time had passed since the hospital, weeks of careful recovery. Mason had undergone physical therapy to strengthen his muscles again, sessions where he squeezed soft foam balls, stretched tiny tendons, relearned balance and coordination. Elias had sat by him through all of it, and through it all, Rocco had waited patiently outside the therapy room, tail thudding whenever Mason reappeared. Now, seeing his son outside in sunlight rather than inside under fluorescent bulbs, this was a new season. The Rowan home was different now. No extra footsteps on the stairs when Elias wasn't there. No soft voice narrating medical jargon. No presence of someone who inserted herself into their brokenness. Layla Hart had faced trial in late March. The courtroom was small, formal, smelling faintly of old wood and stale paper. Elias hadn't attended every session, but he had been there for the verdict. Layla had entered in a county-issued jumpsuit, hair unkempt, and eyes that held something shattered. She never looked directly at Elias, only at Mason, seated with Nurse Carter a few rows behind. Layla's lawyer argued psychological instability, misguided dependency impulses, emotional fixation, But the evidence was undeniable. Pharmacy records showing missing medication from her clinic supply, forged symptom logs, toxicology charts, fingerprints on the vial. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and uncompromising eyes, pronounced the sentence with solemn clarity. Not dramatic, not vengeful, simply factual. Years in state correction, lengthy psychological evaluation, permanent loss of medical licensing, and no future contact allowed with Mason or Elias. As Layla was led out of court, she finally looked at Elias, not with rage, but with searching emptiness, as though looking for someone who might still see her as redeemable. He looked back, but only with quiet finality. And then she was gone. Now life was not perfect. Grief and danger had left their fingerprints on the Rowan household, but it was healing, slowly, like frost receding from soil. Inside the house, Elias had begun his new schedule. No more night shifts. He had formally transferred to daytime K-9 training operations. His colleagues understood. No one questioned the move. In the daytime unit, Elias trained younger officers and their K-9 partners on obedience, search protocols, scent tracking, and danger alert. It was quieter work, purposeful, stable, anchored near home. When he came home each afternoon, Mason would be there, either painting, building toy structures, or watching the thawing creek beside the house. And Rocco had taken on a new role, not just partner, but emotional lifeline. One early evening, Elias took them both to the town park at the edge of the forest. The snow there had thinned to a delicate crust, revealing patches of damp soil and bristling grass. Mason sat on a wooden bench shaped like a bear, eyes bright with the quiet curiosity that was returning to him. A week ago, something small but important had happened. Mason had spoken voluntarily to Nurse Carter during therapy. A full sentence? 2, actually. Now, as he sat on the bench, he looked down at his shoes for a long moment. Then he slowly untied the left one. He took it off, held it upside down, almost trembling. Nothing fell out, nothing hidden, no secret vial, no poison, just his small sock-covered foot, pinkened by new warmth. Mason let out a shaky exhale, then gave a tiny laugh. Elias watched from a short distance, eyes stinging, but stayed back, letting his son experience that victory privately. Rocco nudged Mason gently and licked his hand. The boy giggled, a sound Elias hadn't heard since before the sickness. Later, as the sun drifted low across the mountains, painting streaks of amber and gold across the melting snow, Elias knelt before Mason and opened his arms. The boy leaned into him, warm, alive. Rocco pressed close, head fitting naturally into the embrace like a third pillar of their small, rebuilt world. Elias spoke softly, voice steady yet emotional. "He saved you, and you saved me." Mason looked up. His voice, though still soft, had strength now. "Rocco knew?" Elias nodded. "He did, and I didn't listen soon enough." Mason touched Rocco's cheek and whispered, "You always listen." In that moment, the future felt possible again. Blue Ridge would soon shift from winter to spring. The creek would run clear, wildflowers would poke through, and sunlight would linger longer each day. One morning, while Mason was inside coloring a book, Elias brewed coffee and stepped onto the porch. Mildred Carver approached down the path. She wore a teal coat and her snow boots, and her hair was pinned in its usual bun. Elias greeted her warmly. "Morning, Mildred." She patted his arm. "Morning, dear." She looked toward the yard, where Mason was now waving a toy airplane. "He looks better each day." Elias nodded. "He's getting there." Mildred's voice dropped, full of truth. "That dog, he knew long before any of us." Elias glanced down at Rocco lying at his feet, eyes half closed in contentment. "Yes," he replied, "he did." Mildred then said something that stuck with him. "Sometimes God speaks through those who have no words." Elias felt that deeply. Rocco lifted his head, as if he understood. Months later, when the snow had melted completely, Elias stood on a hill overlooking the town, Mason holding one hand, Rocco trotting ahead. A warm wind brushed the trees. The pain of the past winter wasn't forgotten, but it had been transformed. Now it served as a reminder of vigilance, of trust, of love that persists even in freezing dark, and of the dog who had never abandoned his post. That evening, in the fading light, Elias, Mason, and Rocco stood together beneath a sky streaked with pink and lavender hues. Not just father and son, not just pair, but a pack, a family that had seen winter and chosen spring. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive in thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come softly through the loyalty of a dog who refuses to abandon his child, through the courage of a father who finally listens to his heart, and through the silent grace that God places inside ordinary moments. In our everyday lives, we each face seasons of cold, places of fear, confusion, or worry. But God walks beside us even then, guiding our steps, sending comfort in unexpected forms, and reminding us that we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement. Today, leave a comment to tell us your thoughts and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles God sends. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength. And please remember to support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing stories of hope, compassion, and redemption to many hearts.